VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And a pleasant good afternoon. Vic and your host here today, as we are joining you once again with a program of information and giving you a chance to respond with your questions and comments. The issue we're going to talk about today has been one that has become more prominent in recent days, months, and years. This issue of your identification. And, of course, all of a sudden, in fact, I purchased a computer system about a year ago, and along with it had a funny-looking little pad, and you plug it into the USB port, and it then said, this is your biometric password, meaning if I chose one of my fingers and used that fingerprint as the password, I would be able to index my computer. Well, frankly, I threw the thing out. I didn't want it. If I can't type the password, I shouldn't be there anyway. Because, here we are now talking about the biometrics. Then let's talk about other means of security. You find that they're using the iris of the eye. The unique pattern that God has given to each person is different. And the ability to use this as an index, an indicator, a connection. We're going to be talking about this, and our special guest is Mark Lerner. He's the author of the book entitled Your Body is Your I.D. It's a new book out this week, and we say welcome, Mark Lerner. Good to have you with us.
It's good to be with you this afternoon, Vic.
Mark, if I can talk a little bit about you, you were a confidant of most senior people in the biometrics sector. You spent the last 6 years openly speaking out against the same industry that you once supported. You testified before many state legislatures on the subject of biometrics, RF identification, and we have talked about that system before with the chips and the scanners and all that stuff. You've talked about identification cards, national and international cards, and on many occasions you've met with senior staff people in Washington, D.C., senators and congressmen, legal counsel for committees. And so you've been really marking the trail with your concerns, haven't you?
Yes, I co-founded an organization called the Constitutional Alliance. Mm-hmm. And the purpose of the Constitutional Alliance is to leave the door open for many other groups, organizations that have concerns about a variety of issues. It can be health care, it can be taxes, the deficit, wars, etc. But it's our feeling at the Constitutional Alliance, someone has to make sure that our individual freedoms and state rights are protected so that we can have legitimate and honest discourse about the many issues and challenges that our country is confronted with.
Now, you're talking about states' rights, and Arizona has really been rattling the cages in Washington.
Yeah, and I worked with some of the lawmakers in Arizona. I've dealt with Senator Pierce and others in the Arizona legislature. We have concerns about that legislation, but our concerns are not based on whether or not there's a need for the legislation. It's just the approach that Arizona has taken. And what I simply mean by that, once again, we have a state that is really going to be feeding the addiction, and the addiction is one of information that the federal government has really developed. And we think that the states have the ability on their own to control the identification document process, mm-hmm. protecting the rights of the state and the individuals.
Well, now you're talking about Your Body is Your I.D. Tell us about this book. Where did you get the idea to start it, and tell us more.
Well, as you had mentioned earlier, I've spent the last several years going state to state, testifying before committees regarding the Real ID Act 2005 and other pieces of federal legislation that really require that more and more information of American citizens is transferred from both states and corporations to the federal government.
What is this thing that's happening just this week? We hear about all our medical records are going to be computerized now.
Yeah, the idea is, again, to centralize information. And whether it's medical records or information in the Department of Motor Vehicle databases, at the end of the day, what's happened in our country, and I want to be upfront, there is a need to protect ourselves from people that are extremists, okay? That's undeniable. And we do have to do something about undocumented or illegal people in our country. What we take offense to is the federal government strategy in the way they're doing this. We have been working with state lawmakers around the country as well as people in Washington, D.C., and we have what we believe to be a very viable alternative. So it's not just a question of, yes, we're opposed to a lot of what the federal government is doing, but the fact is we have a very doable alternative, and specifically when it comes to protecting people's religious freedom.
Well, what exactly is a surveillance society?
Well, and that's a good question. A surveillance society is one where we learn growing up the who, what, how, when, and where when you're writing. Well, a surveillance society allows the government to know who you are, where you're at, what you're doing, who you're doing it with, and when you're doing it. So when a surveillance society actually does exist, and we make the argument, I do in the book, that we already are at that point. At that point, the people really no longer control government. The government controls the people through what I describe in the book as indirect control and direct control. And biometrics is at the heart of this. And for your listeners that aren't familiar with biometrics, commonly we think of fingerprints, which is the example you used, and iris scans. But the biometric of choice right now, internationally, is what's known as facial recognition. And what facial recognition does, it literally measures the distances between key characteristics of your face, the center of your eyes, your lips, your nose, your mouth, ears, etc. And those measurements, bio meaning body, metrics meaning measurements, those measurements are what we refer to as mapping your face. Now, once that process takes place, it's the computation, if you will, is put on what we call a biometric template. Now, all that really means is whether it's a one-to-one match to check your own biometric template against yourself, in other words, for authentication purposes, or against all other biometric templates that have been collected, what is known as a one-to-many comparison, the idea is the biometrics establish your identity. And facial recognition was named by the ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, as the biometric of choice, primarily because, unlike fingerprinting, where you would put your finger on an ink pad or a scanner, facial recognition is non-invasive. It does not require that the person know that it's being used.
Amazing. Well, years ago, I had to be fingerprinted because of having access to the runways and aircraft access in Milwaukee. And this thing had to go through the FBI, and there was fingerprints, and I forget what else it was, before you could even have permission to step out in certain areas. But we're talking about facial recognition, and there are so many faces that are similar, like identical twins. But really, from a technical standpoint, there's only one of a kind then.
Well, and that's the argument that the industry makes now. We know, and we've looked at all the reports, when I go to testify in front of a committee, I don't take any documents with me. I've been looking at this issue now for about 9 years, roughly 20 hours a day, working with different privacy advocacy groups, directly with the American Center on Law and Justice. They had not addressed the issue of the Real I.D. Act in 2005. Some state lawmakers wrote a letter of introduction to Jay and Skip Ash at the ACLJ. They agreed to meet with me in Virginia Beach. I laid out what was taking place, and it led to about a 117-page document where the ACLJ opposed Real ID Act, the use of biometrics, etc. Then I went to the counterpart, the ACLU. Now, I'm a conservative. I'm not normally a person that would look to the ACLU. But what happened here is this is an issue that crosses all political ideologies. So I went to the ACLU. They were opposed to the Real ID Act. I asked both the ACLU and ACLJ to appear with me at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. They both agreed to do exactly that. It's one of the few times anybody can remember that the ACLU and the ACLJ were on the same stage, talking about the same issue and having the same position.
Well, now, in an age of international terror, is there any option to, this issue of surveillance, facial recognition, how does this work out in the area of terror?
Well, look, our goal is not to impede the job that law enforcement or our intelligence people need to do. If a person's been convicted of a crime or a person is being investigated, if you will, for being connected or part of a terrorist organization, we have no issue with the respective law enforcement or intelligence people obtaining a search warrant or a court order and obtaining somebody's biometrics. We understand the need to do that. The real issue is one of, do we want the government to control the people or the people to control the government? What's happening is, as you create a surveillance society and government knows everything you're doing, we would contend that creates two problems. One, the government has what we call direct control. If you don't have this identification document, you can't do ABC. More threatening than direct control is indirect control. And indirect control I define as when the government is able to inhibit your actions because of the creation of this surveillance technology. For instance, if you were going to go to a town hall meeting or attend a rally, whatever it is that you were going to do, you have a right to do that without having your identity known. And when there's indirect control and you know the government is able to identify you, and people are familiar with CCTV surveillance cameras, and they think of the grainy pictures they see on their news when a convenience store is robbed. Well, CCTV digital cameras, the new ones, are able to capture your facial image in public, and through linking with databases, specifically DMV databases, they're able to determine your identity. Now, some people think that's an Orwellian concept, not ready for practical use today. In fact, in 2001, a company called Visage Technology, now called L1 Identity Solutions, captured the facial image of everybody entering the Super Bowl at Raymond James Stadium. This is 9 years ago. And they compared those facial images to law enforcement databases. And the company announced that a number of people had been arrested because of the use of the technology. Law enforcement later denied the technology was useful at all.
Mark, we're going to come back in 60 seconds with more on this issue of your body as your ID, biometrics, and your freedom. This is Crosstalk. Please stay tuned.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, geologist and president of the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, how fast did the animals migrate away from Ararat after Noah's flood?
Chris, the Bible tells us that after the flood, God commanded the animals to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And that they did, migrating to fill the earth. There are some modern-day examples of rapid animal spreadings, several coming from the island continent of Australia, which until recently had no mammals. Now rabbits are nearly epidemic. Another example would be a particular kind of toad that was introduced in Australia back in the 1930s, and then just 10 years later was observed over 1,000 miles away. Surely the biblical concept of migration to fill the earth is not only possible, but quite plausible. Besides that, it's true, because we're told about it back in Genesis.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. For more info on Genesis, visit us on the web at www.icr.org.